Peter Wade is a professor of social anthropology at the University of Manchester who focuses on issues of race and ethnicity in Latin America. Today, we will be discussing his book, Race and Ethnicity in Latin America, published by Pluto Press in 2010. Or that might be the second edition. And that's the one I've read. So just a couple questions that I like to ask everyone, just like for starters, is like, how did you end up getting into the field of social anthropology? Like, what made you want to research this topic?
Well, those are two different questions. So to take the first one first, I got into social anthropology because, we're talking now when I was 17 years old or 18 years old, pre-university, when I chose to do a social anthropology degree. And a couple of people who were fairly influential. My dad was one of them, and an English literature teacher who I had at school, both said at sort of on separate occasions that if they had had the choice to go back to university and start again, sort of thing, that they think they might have done social anthropology. So that kind of sparked an interest. And at the time as well in the UK, there was a very well-known series of ethnographic films on the BBC, which I used to watch on a regular basis. So yeah, that kind of sparked interest in anthropology. And then when I was doing my degree, I and some friends organized a kind of expedition to the Peruvian Amazon to go and live with some indigenous people, the Ashanika indigenous people, for about 6 weeks or something in the summer vacation. So that kind of sparked an interest in stuff around indigeneity and, well, certainly Latin America, that I'd never been to Latin America before at that stage. And then afterwards, when I graduated, I then traveled with another friend of mine. We started in New York and ended up in Colombia. And the overall experience was kind of circum-Caribbean, in the sense that we spent a lot of time. We traveled obviously all the way through Mexico, Central America, and so on. But we spent a lot of that time on the Caribbean coast of mainland Central America, etc. So that kind of experience of black-white interaction around tourism and so forth, and the kind of the presence of a history of enslavement, etc., sparked an interest for me in questions around sort of race and racism and so on. And then I spent about a year living in Cartagena in Colombia, where one sort of observed at first hand certain questions of racial inequality and racism and so forth. So yeah, so then when the opportunity came to do a PhD, that was what I chose to focus on.
When you did this trip, was it more like you did it via buses, or did you rent a car or buy a car and drive down?
No, we were on buses mainly, and hitchhiking and so on.
Okay, so was that you hitchhiked through Latin America?
Well, no, yeah, a little bit. I mean, in Latin America, we're mainly on the bus. Hitchhiking was in the USA.
Okay.
But we tried a bit in Mexico. We tried a bit of hitchhiking as well.
Okay, yeah, I did something that the reason I got into my topic was actually I did it kind of in reverse, but I bought a car in Buenos Aires and then drove back to California.
Okay.
And so I stumbled upon the Mennonites when I was in Paraguay and then in Belize. But yeah, I couldn't, it was difficult enough driving. I couldn't imagine taking hitchhiking or taking buses everywhere. So yeah, that must have been a very sharp experience. Do you remember, like, because was that the first time that you really conceptualized that Latin Americans were multi-ethnic? Because I'm from California, so really when you think of Latino or you think Mexican, and this is kind of the stereotype in the US in general, so there's not really a conscious acknowledgement, or it's not well known that, yeah, like there's lots of Chinese Mexicans, there's Mexicans, etc. So it's very funny in a lot of ways that it can cause like a lot of confusion for Americans when they travel.
Mm.
Did you always kind of know that Latin America was multi-ethnic because of your trips for the Andes and knowing that there was indigenous and then Spanish Peruvians, or was there some moment that was kind of jarring where it's like, why are these Black people speaking Spanish?
Yeah. No, I mean, the presence of indigeneity was obvious.
Yeah.
And as a social anthropologist, that was quite clear, that's what interests most anthropologists who study Latin America is indigenous people. So yeah, the encounter with Black people, with Afro descendants and so on. I mean, I guess we kind of came a little bit in touch with that on that area of Mexico on the southwestern coast around the Costa Chica, they call it, around Guerrero and Oaxaca, on those coasts there, where we spent some time. So you kind of got a bit of a sense there that there was something else going on, even in Mexico. But really, we kind of encountered that in Belize and the Caribbean coast of Guatemala, where you have and in Belize, obviously, you have a black population. It was a British colony, etc. And so there you got a very strong sense of blackness, and then sort of mestizo, typical kind of Latin American mestizo population, and then also indigeneity, and then also in that place. East, people from India, kind of indentured people who are descendants of indentured laborers and so on. So you got that very strong sense of that multicultural, multi-ethnic presence. And then in the Caribbean coast of Guatemala, you also have the Garifuna population, which is the descendants of people who came from the island of St. Vincent, which was a British, well, it was occupied by lots of different European powers, but was ultimately a British colony. Where lots of kind of escaped enslaved peoples and shipwrecked enslaved peoples and so on had ended up on this island and mixed with the local indigenous Arawak population. And then the British decided, when they couldn't control these people, and so they decided just to kind of displace them en masse to some islands off the coast of Honduras. Where they spread out, into Belize and even into northern Nicaragua as well. The Garifuna are people who speak a very specific kind of indigenous language, or language with strong indigenous roots. So there was very clear that these people were very different from the rest of the Guatemalan population. And then in Colombia as well, it was very clear that it was a kind of an Afro region in general, especially Cartagena was, in particular.
Yeah, but my wife is Colombian, and I lived in Colombia for several years. So yeah, it's very interesting how the coasts are very much Afrocentric, with Pacifico and La Costa, like Cartagena, Santa Marta. So I don't actually know much about social anthropology. Is it pretty much the same as cultural anthropology, or there's some difference?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, some people would draw a distinction in terms of historically the way that it's been approached in the UK or in Europe, versus the USA, but essentially they're the same thing.
Okay, so because I know that the anthropology department at the University of Iowa, there's more of a focus on direct interviews, like collecting data via survey. But in your book, there was quite a bit of secondary literature, and I don't know if you ever went into archives, which is much more of the historians did, but I was curious, what was the hardest part of this research? Because it's such a massive area, and you do delve into a lot of different regions. When you were writing the book, and it's been quite a long time now, but if you can remember, what was the hardest part of the research?
Well, I mean, it was a book that was kind of, in some ways, based on a course that I'd been giving at the University of Liverpool that I worked at there, which I mean, it wasn't entirely, it was kind of the motivation to write the book came out of having taught that course. So the course itself was more. I mean, I don't want to use just the word descriptive, but it looked at all kinds of different contexts in which Black and Indigenous people live and operate in Latin America, whereas the book is a kind of overview of anthropological approaches to understanding Blackness and indigeneity in Latin America. So the book is more looking at, how have academic approaches to anthropological understanding of these peoples changed over the whole of the 20th century. So in that sense, it was more focused on a secondary literature of, anthropology. But, then obviously that secondary literature itself is based on ethnographic research. So, going and living in particular places for long periods of time and working out, how local people see things and how they work and operate and so on. So in that sense, there is a kind of ethnographic component to it. So I'm not sure what the most difficult part of it was. And I guess writing the second edition was perhaps more difficult in the sense of, that book in 1997, the first edition, it turned out to have, to have made a relatively significant impact, which I wasn't expecting necessarily. So when the second edition came around, or they asked me to do a second edition, then you're suddenly sort of thinking in a slightly different way of, well, how much do I change? How much do I try and include? How to update? There's a lot you could do. And I mean, when I first wrote the book, the point was to be concise, short, direct, and give a kind of very brief overview of the changing approaches. When it comes, to update that, then suddenly, where do you draw the line? How can you, do you try and sort of fix everything or put in everything that you left out before, or do you just sort of, update the most notable parts and so on? So that was probably the hardest part, I think.
Okay, maybe asking this a different way, like if you were to revise it for a third edition, and I don't know if you are or not, but like with recent events, with the Black Lives Matter and things like that, do you think that you would approach it in a different way, or do you think that maybe you would tie that into the conclusion? Like, what changes, if you would revise it for a third edition, are there any changes you would make to the book?
Oh yeah, I mean, they did ask me to do a third edition, but they asked me a long time ago, and very soon after the second edition had come out. So at that stage, I said, well, no, I don't think that there's really enough has changed to make it worthwhile to do a third edition now. And if I did a third edition now, then there would be quite a lot to change. And again, this, the hard part would be deciding, well, what are you going, how are you going to approach this? So one thing that you'd have to look at would be whiteness, for example, the whole question of whiteness and whiteness studies, which in 2010 was not such an issue as it is now. I mean, it was around, but it's become more of an issue. The whole question of decolonization, which I do address in the book, has become obviously much more important. So you'd have to kind of expand that quite a lot. There's been a lot of attention, or increasing attention, since, well, I mean, in a way, since 2001 with the Durban conference again about racism, but really since about sort of 2010, there's been an increasing attention to racism as an issue. After all the multiculturalist reforms of the 1990s and early 2000s, there's been a kind of a realization of the limitations of those reforms, and their inability to, in a kind of, they got trapped into this identity politics mold, which didn't really address, in a direct enough way, questions of racial inequality, and nor did they address questions of racial inequality within the mainstream. So it was all about minorities, sort of identifiable minorities, Black minorities, Indigenous minorities, which leaves all those people who are, dark-skinned or black, but don't necessarily identify ethnically as indigenous or Afro-descendant, but who nevertheless suffer racism and who are, in a racially stratified society. All that kind of issue around racism as a transversal force affecting the whole society, that has come up much more to the fore in the last 10 years or so. So those are the kinds of things that I think I would look at now.
Maybe not to be overly self-aggrandizing, but do you think that because it's kind of parallel with the second edition of your book coming out, do you think that your book, which did make several waves, do you think it was kind of at the forefront, or do you think it was just kind of riding a wave of this renewed interest in race and ethnicity in places?
Well, I think, the reason people cite the book, the 1997 book, and still the 2010 second edition, is often because, it's said to be an early attempt to bring blackness and indigeneity into the same analytic frame. So that's the reason that it's been cited quite a lot, I think. So, yeah, I think in that sense, it did sort of, it did break some ground, I think. And, that's an issue that people are increasingly interested in and have become much more interested in the last 20 years or so, yeah.
So in the book, you start off with like this discussion of definitions and defining what is race, what is ethnicity, which is still like, I don't know if we've really completely answered it. And in part, which is what you note, is that it's because these definitions change over time and they're constantly moving targets. And like the people who define them are also constantly moving. And so it's like a race between definer and definition. Sometimes race seems to be defined as lineage, at least early on. Ethnicity comes from a definition of nation, but then race kind of changed into like a genetic category. But there's still some confusion about the differences between race and ethnicity. And of course, that changes over time. Today, what would you say is a good either definition of both, or what do you think are the primary differences or similarities between race and ethnicity?
Well, I always, I always think the defining features of race are that it comes out of a colonial history. So for me, people say, oh, did concepts of race and racism exist amongst the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans? And then you look at the position, what people used to say about Africans in ancient Rome, and or maybe what about the ancient Chinese? Their views of other people, of others. Is that racial in inverted commas? Does it count? Were they racist? Can we call the Chinese, in the 6th century AD, were they racists and so on? And you can find lots of stuff in which they are very rude about people who aren't, who aren't Chinese, and they have sort of naturalizing explanations for why they're like, other people are like they are, and so on. But for me, that could be, and some people do class it as that's a racial thought because it's kind of naturalizing and it's inferiorizing and so on. But for me, it's not, I don't find that very useful. So for me, a racial discourse really starts with European colonialism. And that's one of its kind of defining features, and the particular categories that emerged out of that history: white, black, indigenous, Asia, and so on. Those, for me, that's a kind of key feature about race. And then another key feature of race is that it somehow juggles some kind of combination of ideas about appearance, ideas about essence, and ideas about behavior, that it's somehow some combination of those three. And sometimes one of those three things is going to be more important than others. Sometimes one of them might be a little bit almost absent. But somehow those three things have to be sort of connected in some way. That's the kind of defining characteristic for me of a racial discourse. Whereas And within that, then you find all kinds of changes over time of exactly how race is understood and so on. But those are two kind of key elements for me, is the colonial categories and the colonial history, and that kind of combination of behavior, essence, and appearance. And ethnicity has a very different. Well, I mean, ethnicity used to be pretty much synonymous with race, like in the 19th century. Excuse me, let me just clear my throat. But in the course of the 20th century, then it became increasingly associated with, either used as a euphemism for race. So you can use the word ethnicity without having to mention sort of the slightly toxic or dangerous word race, after the Nazis and et cetera, when race becomes a kind of toxic baggage, or the concept, the idea, the language of race becomes toxic in most environments, not so much in the USA, obviously, or in Britain, but in most of Europe, it becomes that. So people then use the word ethnicity as a kind of way, a euphemism. And in academia, it grows from there into, or it emerges also as a way of talking about cultural difference, rather than something sort of biological stroke phenotypical. So I think those are kind of that's still the case, that ethnicity is different from race because it doesn't necessarily refer to that colonial history. You can talk about ethnic differences without any reference to colonial histories, without any reference to phenotypical differences, although there can be. Ethnicity can overlap. So ethnicity is really a kind of quite a vague and baggy term that can mean lots and lots of different things.
Okay, so in another book, you talk about the intersection of race and gender. In this book, there seems to be some touching on intersections of race and nationality. From my own just knowledge, I know that like certain regions within Latin America have very much their regional identity is very much inclined towards a racial identity. So Sao Paulo is white, Medellin's white, and then the coasts, like we even discussed, are blacker. So do you think that also ties into national discourse, or do you think it's more regional, specifically in Latin America, and then there's constant debates that merge with regional identities, trying to take control of what is the national identity? If you understand my question. I wouldn't exactly, but
yeah, I think I sort of see where you're going. I mean, I think that in Latin America and more generally, a discourse around nation is a way to talk about race without having to talk about race. So you can talk about the nation and its regions and its diversity, especially in Latin America, and especially where there is a strong correspondence between race and region, like there is in Colombia, for example. So you can talk in about the nation and about its regions and about its diversity. You never really have to talk about race. You don't have to mention the word race, or even mention the word blacks or indigenous or anything like that. You can talk about all these things by using a language of race, of nation and region. So any discourse around nation and around region in Latin America tends to have a racialized dimension to it, sometimes stronger than others. But, all through the Andes, Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil, you've always got these kind of regionalized dimensions of race. So that a discourse around the nation, which very often takes a kind of regionalized approach, so that when people talk about the nation or something, then they immediately start talking about the different regions of the nation and the different folklore and music and so on that occur in these different regions, and whether it's possible to somehow integrate all the regions despite their diversity into some national narrative about progress and modernity and so on. So as soon as you start talking in those terms, there's a strongly racialized component to it, in which blackness and indigeneity are associated with the kind of backwardness, and with whiteness with progress and modernity, etc.
Okay, so in the book, at one point, you note that blacks were much less likely to be symbolized, like as representative of a glorious past, like say Mexico uses its indigenous culture. You say Cuba and Brazil are an exception, but there's also, I mean, there's some problems with that as well. So when we speak of like race and ethnicity in Latin America, is it sometimes I feel like, is it more appropriate to instead talk about a policy of anti-blackness than necessarily than blanqueamiento, or a white ideal or a white supremacist nation, because it's much more of a ideal in the negative aspect, where it's that you don't want to be something rather than having this white ideal, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think they're tied to each other. So, the desire to be, I mean, not necessarily white, but at the whiter end of the spectrum, that's a very kind of ambiguous area. So, the idea that you can be too white is also a feature in, people who are like somebody whose PhD thesis I examined, worked in Florianopolis in Brazil, amongst the middle classes there, who are very white because they're all, direct descendants of Europeans. And I mean, he was looking at women in particular. For them, that was a kind of a bit of a problem. It wasn't a major problem, but it was something that was kind of, you could tell from his work. It was something that kind of caused a little bit of anxiety, because they didn't fit the bill of a kind of typical Brazilian woman who's kind of, slightly brown skinned and with curly hair and has a particular kind of body, etc., etc. So, they were always very insistent on their Brazilianness, because when you looked at them, you wouldn't necessarily think, oh yeah, that's a Brazilian woman, So you can be too white in Latin America, and that makes you non-national. It doesn't make you a kind of typical Mexican or a typical Brazilian or a typical Venezuelan or something if you're very white. So, there is that, nevertheless, even though you can be too white, the desire to get close to whiteness and to be at the whiter end of the spectrum, that is something that has driven a lot of policy and a lot of individual behavior in Latin America. So immigration policy on the one hand, and people's kind of, personal marital strategies on the other hand. And, their personal kind of trajectories, what they're trying to achieve in their lives. So that exists, but the counterpart to that, of course, is anti-blackness and anti-indigeneity. So that the thing you don't want to be, the kind of benchmark of what you want to avoid is the typical black person or the typical indigenous person. And you can see that, especially, blackness especially plays that role more than indigeneity, because around indigeneity you have this whole romantic notion of that the indigenous person is somehow the soul of the nation and represents the kind of roots and the authentic element, some authentic element of nationality, which is very strong, not only in places like Peru and Mexico, but even in places like Argentina, you get some element of that. So anti-blackness is so blackness functions much more as the kind of benchmark, of what you don't want to be in most of Latin America, for sure. And I mean, it's less so in Brazil and in Cuba, as I said, as you mentioned, where there has been, the whole kind of rehabilitation of the African ancestry, which has gone on throughout the 20th century, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like based off of my readings, there's like there's a competition to the bottom between how people talk about blackness and indigeneity. So Mexico, if it's more indigenous, tends to have a much worse Black discourse. Brazil, which is more Black, tends to have a much worse indigenous discourse. So with these like regional differences, like how do we conceptualize it as a whole when there are these noticeable differences? Like how do we conceptualize it as Latin America, like race and ethnicity in this larger region?
Well, I think that is because they all share a colonial history. So I don't think you need to talk about Latin America. You can talk about the Americas. There's a common colonial history there, and the Caribbean, and there are variants of how these sort of the three key categories, which are indigenous, African, and European, how those have worked together and the different kinds of outcomes that have emerged. So you do get this patchwork, this kind of mosaic, and people have tried to make lots of people have tried to make comparisons between Brazil and the southern USA, for example. That's a kind of classic historiographical comparison, which is interesting, etc. But what that tends to miss is that within Brazil itself, there's also a huge variety. So the Northeast is very different from the South. The South, as you've said, the South is much more European, etc., and they have a different sense of their own identity. Or within the USA as well, the comparison that's made is always between the enslaved states of the USA and Brazil. So but that of course means that you're not looking at the north of the USA, which is a different thing again. So I think it's that's the way you need to think about it. Is okay, this is a whole hemisphere that experienced the same kind of colonial history. Okay, different variants of it, different labor regimes, different demographic regimes, and so on. And so they end up with a whole kind of spectrum or a mosaic of different arrangements, racial formations.
So my work, one of the things I'm trying to do, ultimately my thesis is I'm trying to explain why the Mennonite colonies make a disproportionate impact on the local economy. So Mennonites, on the whole, comparatively, they make higher wages, they have more wealth, etc. In my readings, especially in Latin American, specifically Mexican discourse, they're not necessarily described as white, although it's implicit, but they're described as German. And so there's a whole discourse, a whole debate about who's better amongst European immigrants. Is it more Germans, English? Like, what are the preferences? So I wonder, because talking about race is important, but at a certain point, it also seems to break down because there's also societal acknowledgement that there's differences between European peoples, or that they're making the same type of groupist categorizations of European people with the same type of stereotypes. So what I guess my question is there a point to where discussing race and ethnicity in Latin America, where it breaks down in its usefulness because it's too much of a broad category, because there are these distinctions?
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, if you're going to look at Mennonites and so on, then you need to focus on that and their particular identity, etc. But I think you can't look at those kinds of ethnic distinctions between, let's say, different subgroups of Europeans. If outside, you can't ignore the frame of race in that, if you're doing that. I mean, you might not want to. It's not going to inform every single aspect of what you look at when you're trying to understand Mennonites and how they become economically successful, because that's got its own series of its own particular explanations around family structure and social capital and cultural capital and so on. But the frame for all of that is still the kind of overall structure of racial hierarchy in which whiteness is seen as a positive thing. Now, when you actually go into that and interrogate that sort of white category, then there will be obviously all kinds of distinctions to be made. or in the case of, of this particular case, then there will be distinctions to be made. So yeah, I think, you need to see race as a frame rather than as an explanation for everything.
Okay.
In that case.
Okay. So I don't want to take too much of your time. I'm just going to ask you one more question, which I pretty much ask everyone is there a book besides your own that you think more people should be paying attention to in your field?
Wow, that's quite a question. I mean, there's lots of books. Yeah, I'm not sure. Thinking of one particular book that I think stands out is really hard. Yeah, I mean, you've stumped me there, I have to say. I mean, I could mention some book just sort of I mean, the introduction to Afro-Latin American Studies, edited by George Reed Andrews and Alejandro Lafuente, that is a kind of groundbreaking book, I think, in terms of what they, establishing the field of Afro-Latin American Studies as a kind of, as a separate subfield. I think that's an important book in that respect. Yeah. And the fact that they managed to get it translated into Spanish and Portuguese, and it's open access in those languages, etc., is it's a milestone, I think. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right, thank you for your time. Seriously, this was a very enlightening, interesting conversation.
Great. Well, thank you very much.